Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
My privilege here to do this event, this lecture tonight for a great aunt of mine and for the behalf of the family here who are represented. Can you imagine that feeling that comes over you whenever all your hard work has been flushed down the drain in front of your eyes? That sinking feeling. That happened a long time ago, in the late 1930s, to Ruth Hannah Dickson, missionary to China, when she was working up in a place called Newchang in northeast China. She had been a missionary for 17 years, and while we think of her as a war hero tonight, from the Second World War perspective, she was already in a war of sorts in that particular point in time. She was, one day she opened the door of a store of millet where she was hiding away from Japanese forces or Japanese occupiers in an attempt to preserve more food for rations for her hospital patients. And to her horror, she discovered that it was covered in creepy crawlies, and she was obviously very disappointed and undaunted. She wasn't going to be beaten. She got her some old Chinese women to clean every piece of millet seed and made sure that her stash of treasure was not lost. That sinking feeling happened again to me this morning, because I prepared a talk yesterday to give today, and I switched the computer on this morning and I had that introduction in my head, and I was to finish it off this morning, and then I was to start this presentation you're seeing now, and all of a sudden the computer had completely black screened on me. Discovered that it has completely failed. All my work from yesterday was lost, and so it started again. So I've only got a few notes here to work from and from memory, but that's sometimes an idea that I'm going to take forward tonight. Sometimes that is a part of Ruth's story as well, that things don't go according to plan, and maybe there's a reason for it. Ruth was up in Newchang in a little hospital there for 17 years at this point in time, in the late 30s, and she was in that sort of situation where you'd be in if you're in eastern Ukraine over the last number of years. The pressure from the Japanese, attrition was going on. They were getting control of the cities up there. They weren't getting control of the countryside. It was basically the Sino-Japanese war from 37 to 41 that was happening before the Second World War, which it developed into. And she, in her own way, was in a war with occupying forces and being resilient against that. And apart from being a war hero later on, I believe you could say about her that she was also a warrior as a nurse as well. She started her nursing career in the golden age of missionary work, and in the early parts of that career there was opposition to mission work in the 20s, but she was ahead of the game. She reinvented herself as a medic, and she was within that strand of medical missionaries who really innovated and made their impact felt through their work. This is her here, which you're probably familiar with, her sitting reading, probably in China. I'm sort of basing a lot of the talk tonight on the information of this little book by Dorothy Crawford, probably published on behalf of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, Missionary Society. That little book was given to me by my Aunt Lila, and it's been misplaced or given to somebody who didn't give it back. But thankfully what I did was I typed it all out onto the computer before I did that, and I uploaded it 20 years ago onto a website, and somehow or other it's wanged itself around and come back on the internet, and it's getting attention more lately in recent years. So it's not been lost. It's been in the family for a long time, but it's becoming more known about, hence the invitation tonight. Now, what the book misses out, another one picks up on. This is another publication that I was made aware of a few years ago by Robert Whiters. It's about the Emperor's Irish slaves, and Ruth Dixon's name comes up in that book as well, and in particularly in chapter 10, when she is among the angels of the Queen's Alexandria Nursing Service at the fall of Singapore. I'll be dipping into that, referencing as well. The two accounts complement each other, some more detailed in some parts than others. I'll refer back to Crawford or Whiters as we move on. Ruth, as a young lady, was born into a family of Carricoleman near Eglish. Her father was Joseph Alexander Dickson. I didn't know about this picture until about 24 hours ago on the internet, and I didn't see this picture before either. So it shows you how her story is building up. That is her mother, Lydia Ann Simpson, who died in 1919. And Ruth had a sister called, only sister called Alice Dickson, her only sister, and she was my grandmother. And in fact, she would be the grandmother of most of the people here tonight as well. So she was the Dixons who have emigrated come back to see from time to time. And that's a picture of her there, probably in 1929, back from furlough in China after 6 years with her sister Alice at Carricoleman, with her nephew and niece Abraham Mackenzie, and her youngest niece in Ireland, Olive, as well. So that the age of the children, basically the age that photograph. And she had a number of brothers. Samuel, who farmed at home with another brother to the left here called Ernest, and the other brothers are in the middle, David, who emigrated to Canada, and also Norman, who emigrated to New Zealand. And Ernest and Samuel farmed together, and so that is the family setup that we're talking about tonight. Back to China again. That is where, again, if you put it on the map, that's where the place where Ruth operated from is located. You can see how far northeast it is, and where Japan is in relation to it. A lot of the story of Ruth starts to go southwest as we go forward. I'm starting with the military side of things tonight because it makes just sense. That's a place called Jakarta down there. That is where she's currently buried. The story I want to actually bring forward now is to the location of Singapore, which is quite a distance away from where she was a missionary for most of her career. As things progressed and the Japanese became more intense in their war of attrition in China, the Missionary Society started withdrawing nurses from China, and Ruth was not by any means the first to leave, but she was probably among the latter ones to leave. And by September 1941, it was time for her to vacate the region and move to evacuate through Singapore back home again. Reluctantly as she was, but she had when she went to get on the voyage, she had a very rough voyage. She arrived in Singapore, her trunk smashed and everything in her cabin ruined in a severe typhoon. But she got to Singapore anyway. But having got to Singapore in September 1941, she was unhappy to discover that there was very little chance of her getting out of Singapore because the pressure from the Japanese on the Commonwealth forces was starting to build up. So the chances of evacuation are quite slim. And what she did was, with that in mind, she decided to volunteer for national service as a 51-year-old woman, having been a veteran missionary nurse. She volunteered and was enlisted into, probably again, the Queen's Alexandria Imperial Military Nursing Service, and it's likely that she worked in the Queen's Alexandra Hospital in Singapore, which was relatively newly built, large and well equipped. However, she wasn't working there long. Well, first I must say to you that her expectations about Singapore were probably dashed when she got there and realised she couldn't get out. If you've been to Singapore, you'll realise how much of a British culture it is. It's a lovely city and was very much very culturally British at the time. A great place to stop over, and she'd have done that many times before. In her furlough holidays, it was a place where you could go and enjoy yourself for a while before you got home. And this is a picture of Ruth dressed up. So I want to just show that picture of her enjoying a bit of style. And I'm sure Singapore was a place to do it, to enjoy the cafes, the cinemas on our way through on her furlough returns home. So that was an expectation she maybe had when she was leaving China, the backwater of China and the underprivileged. She was going to maybe expect a little bit of enjoyment. But when she got there, the chances of doing so, of leaving Singapore, were very limited. And she, rather than do nothing, she enlisted for the Queen Alexandria Military Nursing Service and worked in the Alexandra Hospital, I would presume, basically serving the needs of the British military in Malaya, the Indian forces, Australian and so forth. There was obviously a build-up of military aggression, because 2 months later, in December 1941, the Japanese attacked. They attacked Pearl Harbor simultaneously with an attack on the coast of Malaya. I'll just maybe move forward to that slide there. The Japanese attacked the coast of Malaysia. You can see that Singapore is at the very bottom of it, and they quickly developed their attack into an all-out attack with land, air and sea, and it then developed quickly into a full-scale advance down to Singapore at the bottom. The British forces, which were Malayan and Indian and Australian and British, were outmanoeuvred, under-equipped, under-prepared, and they had no tactical response to the speed of the Japanese advance. While Churchill wanted to defend it to the last man, it was practically impossible given the efficiency of the Japanese. And Singapore basically essentially became a fortress. And the hospitals, as the Japanese advanced, the hospital started to shrink, the perimeter started to shrink, and the hospital started to evacuate until they were concentrated in two hospitals, the Alexandra and the Changi Hospital, where obviously Ruth would have been feeling that congestion, that sense of panic and terror as things closed in and there was no escape from that. The nurses started to evacuate on the 11th, from these hospitals on the 11th of February, and many of them were lost in Japanese attacks on their ships. Ruth was the last to evacuate, and among the last batch of nurses to evacuate, and that's a Changi hospital there where she would have worked. She was the last to evacuate on the 13th of February. At this point in time, she would have been among nurses who were probably much younger than she was, over 50. They'd been young nurses who would have been relatively newly qualified. And I'm just going back. I mean, Ruth had seen active service in the First World War. She was unusual in that she had nursed German prisoners of war in both Wales and France, and this was her second experience of World War nursing. So sure, her maturity had a different level from her colleagues in the nursing service around her, and she also had other experiences as well, and that was that her brother David was a veteran of both World Wars as well. David, who emigrated to Canada, had served in both the First and Second World War in the Canadian forces. Not only that, but her cousin Herbert Alexander, named after her father, he had been shot dead by a sniper on the Western Front in March 1918 as well. So she had not only the experience, if not the fitness of her colleagues, but she had been through the moral dilemmas of war many years earlier, as you can see from this presentation. So Singapore is where she's at, and she's among the last number of nurses to evacuate on the 13th of February 1942. And as she does so, she's going down to the docks to get a ship, and as that's been happening, the Japs are bombing the harbour right, left and centre, and the perimeter is shrinking. And she boards a ship, 940-ton ship called the Koala, and she gets on with 50 other Queen's Alexandria nursing staff, including 6 from Ireland. And she gets onto the ship, and as the bombs are dropping all around, and they leave the harbour at night with a support ship called the Tian Quang, a merchant Chinese ship, as a support vessel, and they leave Singapore on the night of the 13th. And those are the nurses on the ship with her that are from Ireland, among the 50 altogether. They're there because they're to support the likelihood of injuries due to the Japanese attacks. The Queen's Alexandria Nursing Service was formed to be operational close to the front line of battles for Commonwealth forces to preserve life at the earliest stages of injury, and so they were trained to be battlefield efficient, and that is why they were put on the ship along with these passengers of 700 people. And so they get on the ship and they leave the port at night. But before the ship leaves the port, a bomb drops on the deck, and Edith Carroll dies in that, and among other nurses, and she's buried at sea the following day. The ship gets out of port, and they get to an island to hide during the day from the Japanese Air Force, and again the Japs find them, and both the ships are sunk in the attack. There's a bomb hits the ships, and Irene Wright is either killed on the ship or in the water. Another nurse eyewitness report said that the Japs came in 4 times, dive bombing the ships, and to finish them off. They were relatively close to the island, and Ruth is recorded as getting ashore in the Crawford account on a life raft with RAF personnel. A lot of people didn't make it, including women and children who were machine gunned in the water. They got ashore. Thankfully, the island called Pong Pong was not occupied by the Japanese. The nurses, as would have been trained, distributed themselves, worked in shifts to secure life as much as possible with little rations. It was 1 biscuit and half a mug of water per day, some morphine, short supply, and little medical supplies, and tattered nurses' dresses were used for bandages. They managed to reach survivors on both sides of the island and waited for other ships to rescue them. The RAF were scouting for the coastline for boats to get out, and it would be likely that, from all probability, Ruth Dickson was on the shore for longer than some other nurses during the sick time. The 17th, a ship comes and offers to pick some wounded off. It's full of other people who have been rescued from other sinking ships, overloaded, and the seriously wounded are taken off it and taken on it. The following day, whenever it's on voyage somewhere, it gets attacked by a Japanese warship near Bangka Island, and it is sank as well. And an eyewitness nurse refers to the mangled bodies on the ship and the children dying on the life rafts. The following day before they could be rescued. And unfortunately, Bangka Island, where the survivors would have made it ashore, was occupied by the Japanese, and a lot of people were being on the beach, and one of the nurses was among those casualties as well. Some of these casualties here among this group, their time and their location of death and their method of death is not clear, but as best can be ascertained. With Ruth Dickson, they're much clearer. But you can see how they're dropping off the list here as they try to escape. Ruth was fortunately not in that catastrophe. She stayed longer on the island to tend the sick, and eventually she is outpaced by the Japanese occupying forces, and she and that Mary Cooper there, they are taken prisoner, and they eventually find their way to Sumatra and to this place called Palembang, where they are encountered in either a Japanese or a Japanese prisoner of war camp or a civilian camp. It's not known whether they were in camp together or separated, not clear from that. But it's also clear that I think Charlotte Black must have died somewhere exactly in that period as well, after the attack on the other ship. So these two survivors, out of all of that, those escapades from Singapore, make it to this point in time to be prisoners of war. I would say a little bit of Mary. She was a young girl in her 20s, unlike Ruth, and she had her experiences in Palembang were various and moving around different places, had a lot of experiences which were very trying mentally and physically, and she lost a lot of weight. She survived until 1945, and the Japanese became a bit conscious that they were going to be held accountable. They were going to send her home, but unfortunately she contracted beriberi disease, a tropical disease, and died before she could go home. So that is the story of her. And in the case of Ruth, when she was taken prisoner of war, the Crawford account refers to her as being made to work in a Malaya hospital somewhere for a few months, and then for 6 months she was forced into forced labour with Dutch women, and she lost weight rapidly during that time, but she was resilient nonetheless. And then she was brought to Palembang camp, where a lot of women and children joined the group. Maybe that's indication that just as in a civilian camp may or may not be the case. And this is the place where I don't know the timelines of how long she was there for, but the Crawford book refers to very trying experiences that she went through, and they're not explained what they are. Thankfully for us today, and while these ladies had a silent, little speak themselves, there is a reference in Crawford's book to the fact that in that period she managed to get a letter to her brother, and in that letter she wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want." So out of the darkness of that experience, she spoke for us today. So Palembang is where she had her most trying experience, whatever they were, and then she was moved. And I should go back, as I've just missed out a little point. Maybe it's a good point to bring here. When she was first, her ship that she was on was bombed, and she was washed ashore after that bombing, and she tended the wounded. The ship that had accompanied her ship, the Kian Kwang, it was sank as well. And on that ship there was a Corporal Terence McGahan from County Cavan. He was an RAF technician, and he helped the nurses tend the wounded on the beach. And then, as a veteran of Dunkirk, he wanted to make good his escape as well, as everybody was trying to escape, and he was using his own initiative. but he was suffering malaria, and as you know, malaria is a death sentence. It was in the Far Eastern Campaign. In fact, for one soldier who died of battle injuries, 120 more died of tropical diseases, including malaria. So he was very concerned with getting treatment for his malaria and also escaping as well. But he wasn't successful at escaping this time, and he landed on a place called Banca Island over to the right here, and he was imprisoned there. And he recalls that this is in about February 1941, just after the ship en route was on the run. He recalls lying on the grass in the prisoner camp, and 40 Australian nurses were singled out into a group and marched off. And he refers to the fact that it was the last walk 39 of them ever had, and he listened to them crying during the night, and that was in 1941 February. So that was an experience he had there at that particular time. And this is the island that the captured Ruth moves to when she is moved for her last destination from Palembang to Banca Island. And it is in that prison camp that she, while she's not facing the violence that he saw 2.5 years earlier, she's facing the incredulous weight of an infested island with malaria and dysentery, from which there was going to be very difficult abilities to survive. So that is where she was her final destination, and I don't think she was there so long. But she died on by a mixture of repeated bouts of fever and malnutrition. She died on Christmas Eve 1944, and she died among her friends because a Scottish nurse looked after her the final night and had the burial service the following day, and an Irish nurse wrote an epitaph on her grave and marked her grave outside the camp. It was also written in Crawford's account that in Palembang, Ruth did find the dark spaces in the camp to meet with other Christians and have fellowship with them even in those trying circumstances. And this red circle indicates from where she died to where she's now buried today. This is a letter that her brother Ernest received a few years later. It's from the War Graves Commission, and it tells him where she has been buried. And I found this letter, and I used it to contact the War Graves Commission 20-30 years ago and asked them to send me a roll film of the grave. They duly did, and obliged. Thankfully today you can go on the internet and find far better quality photographs of her grave than the ones I received. So people have become interested in this particular story. And that is the photograph that I was sent anyway of her tombstone. And this is the situation that it's found in Java. It's a lovely setting in the Commonwealth War Graves place set aside. So it's a place we would love to visit given an opportunity. This is a photograph that I believe is Ruth. It was among the biscuit box at home, and I never really identified it until recently, and just by, I believe, just deduction, I believe it's her, the situation she's in. And I suppose in a sense we're looking at her tonight as a war hero and the experiences she went through. She served her country, and yet I want to move on to the fact that to see her life in its totality, and the fact that she had already by that stage, before she volunteered for military service again, she had obviously been in the First World War too, but she had done 17 years of nursing experience as a missionary nurse. And as I referred earlier, she was a warrior, and this is maybe one of her days whenever she was getting it tighter than others, and she was at the forefront of missionary initiative and initiative and imagination. She lived through the changes in the way missionary nursing was conducted, but she was like she whenever you read her story and what her missionary experiences were like, you see elements that would be coveted by missionaries of any country today. Does anybody know any famous missionary nurses that went to China? Does anybody know anybody?
Gladys Aylward?
Gladys Aylward, yes. Gladys Aylward was a few hundred miles away from where Ruth was operating, and Gladys Aylward story was made into a famous film called The Sixth Inner of Happiness. Made $44 million of tickets for the box office. She she famously got a lot of children out of destitution. She marched children over the hills away from the Japanese threat of violence. The story of the film, you should watch it because it is fictionalized, but it gives you a context to the violence that was in the 1930s China that Ruth would have experienced. So the film has got a lot to offer for you to understand the situation Ruth was in as a missionary in the 1930s in China. But where the film goes off is it fictionalizes her life in the sense of gives her romantic liaison with some officer, and she delivers her children to safety, and then she goes off with her for her romantic thereafter. The real Gladys Aylward didn't do that. But the other thing with the film that's very remarkable is that it also shows that Gladys Aylward was focusing on what was in her power she could use as a missionary to promote the cause that she was standing for as a Christian missionary. And she discovered, as Ruth discovered, that women in China were very impressed by the culture that they belonged to. Children young girls their feet were bound up and they were babies, and that was because it was feminine to have tiny feet, and it was a great cause of suffering for women, and it was part of the culture. And Gladys became a foot inspector, and she had such an influence in bringing that to an end. She also, as I said, looked after a lot of children and prevented them from becoming thrown away. The girls were very, very poorly valued, and there's crossover between these two women here, and one became famous and her story was fictionalized. Thankfully, Ruth's story has been preserved from that problem tonight. But Ruth had other things that she did. She realized the power that her influence would have as a woman in China, and she made the maximum use of it. She was a tutor as a nurse matron in the hospital. She trained young girls to improve the standard every year she was there, and she basically raised the standard year on year until she got them sitting their national examinations to be a nurse anywhere in the world from small beginnings. She also was able to displace what was predominantly a male occupation with women in the hospital. She realised that her ladies that came into the hospital were very tired and isolated in their lives at home, and she provided with her Christian mentoring of her students that atmosphere that really broke the barriers down in a culture which would have been relatively alien to the gospel message. She facilitated the meetings and the services that were there to provide the Christian atmosphere for that hospital. She mentored students in their devotional life as well, and apart from raising the standards, there's one story I believe that also has a direct correlation with Gladys Aylward, and that is that a little woman called Mrs. Mrs. Chow. Mrs. Chow came in one day for her 9th pregnancy. All previous 8 pregnancies had miscarried, and the 9th one was a wee boy, and he duly died 24 hours later. and she was about to go home crying in destitution. But Mrs. Yen, next door, she was coming in for her fit, and she had another girl, an unwanted girl. And Mrs. Ruth Dickson realised that there was a deal to be done here, and Mrs. Chow went home with her first child, a wee girl, because little girls were part of the problem in the sense of their value in China was of such low worth. Ruth was able to use those opportunities for the greater good. An example of the culture that she lived in. There's just so many little stories that you can read from the Crawford book, and it's online if you want to read it. But it's sort of it's difficult to know how to wrap up this life that I've just spoken about tonight, and for me to invite you or prompt you to interpret it, what it means, because at this present time the country of China is being considered to be the pariah, and Japan is our erstwhile ally, and the geopolitics of the world have changed, and it makes people who sit on the sidelines or look at this life from a distance wonder what is the meaning of it. And I don't want to give you the answer to that. I want you to go home and dig through it yourself. But I believe that Ruth's mission is not complete. There's a reason for these things, and even the fact that my presentation tonight was lost in the failure this morning. I came here late. All of those things I believe have got a plan, and her death is not a mistake either. And the fact that she became a military nurse has actually brought interest to her life that would not have been there if she had died missionary nurse, unfortunately. That's the way people see things. So the warrior Ruth was always a warrior, whether she was a nurse in the mission field, dealing with the oppression of women, seeing her role and fighting for their ability to be better themselves, to experience the gospel for themselves. She was innovative in making the mission, the medical side of missionary, a place where missionaries could continue their work. And as the 40s progressed, missionaries were no longer allowed into China. But the work she was involved in maybe can be only partly measured by the fact that today there are, by year 2018, there were 44 million Christians in China. And that's only 0.03% of the population. In 1940 there were only 4 million, and prior to that was only a few hundreds of thousands. So there is something there we don't know the answers to, but we must leave it with the providential will of God. That service that is that has been offered in Christ's name has a lot more to go, and we are only seeing part of it tonight. So that is the life that I think I want to leave with you. And I don't believe I've done the justice, particularly on the mission side, but there's a little book for you to go and read at your own leisure online as well, and that's what I encourage you to do. Any questions? One other wee thing I suppose would actually, I'll just look at some notes here. Ruth was someone who actually had the gift of Irish hospitality. The little book refers to the fact that when her colleagues in the bigger hospitals in the bigger towns were actually run down, when they were tired and depressed, they would come to her little compound over in New Chang, and they would get a few days rest in the peace and quiet. They would get plenty of reading material in our living room, an open fire in the winter time, which was unusual for a mission house, and she had lots of plants, and she had breakfast in bed for them. Weary travellers were welcome, and so she had that hospitality and many friends, which I believe when you don't read the book for yourself, you don't get a sense of who she was. But she had a great sense of humour. She had humility and modesty about her, which again comes out in the book. But apart from that, you really need to make sense of the life that she offered to God yourself, and be challenged by it. I don't believe it's a life of parts. I believe it's a whole life, and the service was continuous throughout, just in different uniforms, and it does make sense, but it's up to you and me to actually work it out for yourself, and be challenged by it.
Do we know, did she ever come back home to Ireland for a break or anything?
Right. Well, that photograph in 1929 would have been 6 years into her missionary journey. She's with her niece and nephew and her sister in Kerry Coleman. So there was obviously that, and I referred to the fact that she would have probably liked to be in Singapore for a little stopover. But apart from that, the book, Crawford's book, does say that in 1940 and 1941 she declined to go home because she wanted to get her student nurses over the line for the examinations. But I believe the backdrop to that is the Japanese were putting more and more pressure on, and she wanted to maintain the standard despite the pressure. So she denied herself a holiday in 40 and 41, which then goes on to my next point, which is when she arrived in Singapore, she was very, very tired already, and she started service after that. So she started off as a 50-year-old woman among young, fitter women, and then as Singapore was starting to come in, and then the evacuations. And the also thing I should mention is that the hospital in the Alexandra Hospital she left in Singapore on the 13th of February among the last batch of nurses who were reluctantly went. They were ordered to leave. They left the hospital. Within 24 hours, when Singapore capitulated, 300 soldier patients were massacred in the hospital, including one guy on the operating theatre unconscious as well. So that sort of gives you a sense that the evacuation was necessary in any case, because the St. Stephen hospitals in Hong Kong up the coast had seen a massacre too of nurses, and they couldn't allow it to happen again. So the gory details sometimes can actually overshadow the meaning of the life, which is also something I want to. The other film from the 1950s relating to that period is The Bridge over the River Kwai, the film of the Burma Railway, and you know that film is also highly fictionalised as well. The bridge that would have been along the railway maybe wasn't as impressive as the one in the film, but the film underplays the fact that 13,000 POWs died in the construction of the railway, and also 100,000 civilians, and that's not reflected in the film. And there was a lot less collaboration in the real life than there was in the film. So the fiction that we see, that we think we use to understand the situation then, is something that thankfully Ruth hasn't yet suffered from. Yeah. Oh, sorry. There's another little picture, I believe it's Ruth as well. I wonder, is that her brother from New Zealand? I'm not sure. But what I'm actually just wanting to contrast is that this is probably the same house in our mission compound in China, New China. One left, maybe a hard day, on the right is her hospitality and her beaming smile and enjoying herself, showing what the different sides of life in the hospital that she. I'm reasonably certain that's her. Nobody has told me that that's the photograph. But it was in a biscuit box for years, and I sort of decided that it must be her, but nobody could tell me otherwise. And it looks from. I had a shortage of photographs to compare with them, but now that I've had more given to me to refer, I would say that this is her. But it actually, you know, gives you a greater sense of the person, and that was one of the objectives I wanted to do tonight, was to bring that distant person that's lying many thousands of miles away home to her relatives as well, and to offer her back to her relatives as someone who's real and is not somebody who's a fictional hero, but was ordinary but just did great things.